Hello and welcome back to the Ruslan Belov channel. Well, the fighting on the front hasn't stopped, and we continue to analyze the situation. Let's turn to the map. So friends, we have some good news from the front, both from the north and the south. Where should we start? Traditionally, we move from north to south, but today let's do the opposite. Start from the south and move northward. So we've received good news from the Zaporizhzhia region. Remember about a week ago, or maybe even a little less, I told you and made an entire episode about how our guys crossed the river and landed on the right bank in the settlement of Kamyanske. This event was extremely important, at least because the Russian army had not been able to carry out such an operation since 2022. They had reached these positions in the southern part of Kamyanske nearly 3 years ago and had remained on the left bank the entire time. But now our guys conducted a brilliant operation, broke into the northern part of Kamyanske and managed to gain a foothold there. At that time, there was a question. Would they be able to hold it? Because the high ground in the area was under the control of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, AFU. Two options remained: either advance further, storm the heights and take them, or retreat if that failed. But as you can see, the AFU failed to drive the Russian army out of the northern part of Kamyanske. On the contrary, Russian troops have continued to expand their zone of control. Over the past 24 hours, there's been notable progress here, about 3 square kilometers, and all of it consists of residential areas and high ground. Let me show you the terrain map to make things clearer. As you can see here, there's a low area, then a rise, and finally a high point. The last street runs right along the ridge, so you can clearly see the elevation difference between the low ground and the heights. Now you understand, the troops didn't just take residential buildings, which is already important in itself, they also took the high ground. This very elevation is what had previously prevented them from moving forward and had kept them stuck on the same contact line for years. But now this solid AFU defense has finally been broken through. That said, Kamyanske hasn't been completely taken under control yet, according to some bloggers, because Ukrainian forces are still holding out in this northern district, and the eastern part hasn't been fully cleared either. Nevertheless, about 80% of the village is already under Russian control. Our guys continue working, and I'm sure that soon we'll see further territorial gains by the Russian army here. A few more words about the Zaporizhzhia direction. What do these recent successes give us, and what prospects do they open up? You know, the prospects are actually quite promising, though I don't believe we'll be able to shift the front line significantly here. That's because there's a river, and it's very hard to cross. To make matters worse, immediately after the river, there are heights occupied by the AFU, so crossing the river is already a difficult task, and crossing it when the opposite bank is higher and fortified by the enemy is an extremely difficult, nearly unrealistic challenge. The fact that we had been stuck here for 3 years confirms this. It seemed like a dead and hopeless sector, and no one expected success here in the Zaporizhzhia direction. But Russian soldiers proved otherwise, so what can we expect once the AFU is completely pushed out of the right bank of Kamyanske? 2 settlements come into view. The first is Plavny, which is closely linked with Kamyanske. One village smoothly transitions into the other, so the fighting will simply shift there. Russian forces are now just 400 meters from the outskirts of Plavny. The second settlement is Stepnohursk. Once Ukrainian forces are pushed out of Kamyanske, they'll likely retreat there. It's about 3 kilometers away. So remember these names, Plavny and Stepnohursk. These 2 villages will soon become frequent mentions in future updates from the Zaporizhzhia front. That said, don't expect a rapid breakthrough here. The Zaporizhzhia direction is extremely difficult, so even slow movement is already an achievement. We shouldn't expect the same pace of advance as in the southern Donetsk region. Now let's move on. Toward the southern Donetsk region, a large area north of the village of Shevchenko has come under Russian control. The data is confirmed by video surveillance. In this area, Russian troops are advancing toward the settlement of Voskresenka. A bit further north, we're getting information from neutral mapping services indicating that most of the village of Podubna has also come under Russian control. Additionally, there have been numerous strikes on the road leading to this village. It appears Russian drone operators have taken over the local logistics. This road connects to the settlement of Alexandra Klevtsovo, where the Russian army destroyed a bridge. In 2025, this war has shown that logistics play a key role in any operation. Without logistics, the enemy quickly loses initiative and eventually all positions. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, no new updates for now, and frankly, there's nothing to expect here yet. After Dakhny, there's a nearly 9-kilometer road to Novopavlivka, but no one will attempt to go there now. As you can see on the map, it's a huge settlement, larger in area than even a city like Selidov, so we'll only advance there once the flank here starts to move forward. For that, control must first be established over Moravka, which is currently seeing intense fighting. Once that's taken, we'll be able to move toward Novopavlivka from 3 directions, south, east and north. We talked about Pokrovsk in detail yesterday. Until this Terracon, a spoil heap, with a height of nearly 120 meters is captured, no real progress should be expected. Good news keeps coming from the N32 highway area, where Russian forces are attempting to take several villages at once to solve the problem of both Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad in one move. The settlement of Razin has come under Russian control, and forces are now consolidating there. This village is significant because it lies north of the larger settlement of Novoekonomikna, and roads from here lead directly to Novoekonomikna. This location is extremely important, and it's impressive how quickly Russian fighters were able to take control of the area. In this sector, Russian forces need to take the settlement of Rodinske, which is key to both Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. The fall of Rodinske would significantly accelerate and simplify the collapse of the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration. How quickly this will happen is anyone's guess. The fighting is unfolding right before our eyes, and we'll continue watching this battle for 2 of the largest settlements in Donetsk. There are only a few cities like these 2 still under Ukrainian control in Donetsk region. In the Kostyantinivka sector, things are quiet for now, no new advances. At the same time, some promising reports are coming from Chasiv Yar. They say that the Shevchenko micro-district has been taken, along with the village of Mykolivka, and that the AFU now only holds the southern part of the city. But so far, this is only based on claims. No visual confirmation has been received at this time, so there have been no map changes yet. But I want to believe the news is true. Local fighters say the battle for the city is nearing its end, but about 2 more weeks of fighting remain. The AFU is still partially maintaining logistics and is putting up strong resistance, because this settlement is extremely important for them, and for the Russian army as well. I really hope that the Chasiv Yar saga will finally come to an end soon. Now let's move north. Yesterday there was an interesting development in the Kharkiv region, on a new section of the front. Our troops crossed the demarcation line and entered the village of Malov. Russia's Ministry of Defense announced that the entire village had been taken under control, and as you can see, the village is quite large and stretches nearly 6 kilometers from north to south. Confirmed footage, including a flag raising, was only shown from this central part, so only the middle is currently marked in red on the map. The rest remains in the grey zone. But I doubt Ukrainian forces are still present there. They didn't have large numbers in the village, so entering and taking the entire settlement, especially since it lies right on the border, was not difficult. Can we expect something major from this? I don't think so. Of course, it would be nice to see a push from Malov to Veliki Burluk, but that's a 20-kilometer distance, so nothing will happen there in the near future. However, as an additional pressure point to force the AFU to redeploy troops, yes, it's a good strategy. Ukraine has an increasing problem with troop numbers, and the more pressure points they have to respond to, the more overstretched they become, leading to setbacks across various fronts, which is something we periodically see, like in the south of Donbass. Well, that's it for today's update on the front lines. Now let's move on to the political situation. Ukraine will try to restore the flow of weapons from the United States, which was unexpectedly cut off by the Pentagon. Volodymyr Zelensky has a plan for this scenario and a long-term strategy for confrontation with Russia, funded by the Europeans. His problem is Trump, but Trump is everyone's problem. The suspension of some categories of US weapons deliveries to Ukraine is a kind of weight that President Donald Trump has hung around Volodymyr Zelensky's neck, to bring him closer to the ground and make him face reality. He's doing this for both political and personal reasons. The personal reasons are simple. Trump doesn't like Zelensky. This observation no longer needs proof. The US president doesn't hide his attitude toward the Kyiv native, and multiple processes are now underway around Ukraine that suspiciously resemble an attempt to undermine the commander-in-chief, including criminal cases against his closest circle. As for the political reasons, Trump wants Moscow and Kyiv to at least halt the fighting long-term, if not sign a peace agreement. This isn't possible without fulfilling Russia's conditions, none of which Zelensky is willing to accept. Therefore, pressure will continue to be applied to Zelensky, while at the same time exploring the possibility of replacing him. This tactic also includes parallel pressure on Moscow to push it toward compromise, namely dropping some of its demands regarding Ukraine. Most likely, in Russia's case, the weight will be another sanctions package. Its core idea is to sharply increase export tariffs for countries that purchase Russian energy or its derivatives, gas, oil, uranium, gasoline, fuel oil, and so on. The US Congress is expected to begin reviewing the corresponding bill in July. This process may drag on, and ultimately, the decision lies with Trump. The law would give him the power to impose new sanctions, but wouldn't obligate him to do so. Moreover, it is highly doubtful the sanctions package will pass in the form originally proposed. Otherwise, it could shock the markets, hurt US economic interests, and be difficult to enforce administratively. Most likely, the bill will be softened, but still passed. It fits with Trump's peace through strength concept and aligns with the visible part of the White House's strategy. Let Moscow and Kyiv keep negotiating, with extra motivation to end the fighting, and we'll see where it leads. Essentially, Trump doesn't care about Ukraine's future or its territorial integrity. He's already made that clear. However, he's also not satisfied with a scenario where Kyiv completely collapses following a major military defeat, the so-called Afghanistan scenario. While the events in Ukraine may not be Trump's war, it is still a US project, and they want to end it on their own terms. Otherwise, it will be not Trump's victory, but Putin's, and a triumph of Russian military power over NATO's military machine on a single front. For his part, Zelensky is planning to outlast Trump, to wait for the next US elections and, if the Democrats win, restore the romantic mismatched relationship with America, reminiscent of the Biden era. But first, he has to survive until those elections. The commander-in-chief refuses to make concessions to Moscow and continues to follow the same strategy: fight as long as there are troops and weapons, while waiting for a window of opportunity to appear. Kyiv's ideal scenario for such a window is a revolution in Russia with regime change. Failing that, a full-scale war between Russia and NATO would do, an old dream, but a deadly one, and therefore not a top priority. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians will likely attempt to provoke the opening of such a window through terrorist attacks and special operations, just as they've done before. One important adjustment to Zelensky's strategy was forced by reality itself. The commander-in-chief has realized that multi-billion-dollar grants and free US weapons are over. He hasn't fallen into despair, though. He plans to purchase this weaponry at market prices. This is his business proposal to Trump, businessman to businessman. Apparently, European leaders have explained to Zelensky that they are unable to replace some categories of weapons that will be lost if the US pulls out of the Ukraine project. However, they are ready to allocate funds for purchases, if Zelensky can strike a deal with Trump. It's not that the EU currently has spare cash, but they've already committed to finding it, not for Zelensky, but for Trump. The gradual increase in defense budgets to 5%, agreed upon at the NATO summit, is precisely about that. The idea is that military support for Kyiv will be included in that 5%.